Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the term and welcome to our first speaker event. Today, we are going to be discussing China's climate policy. China has the highest absolute carbon emissions. Among the major economies, it has the highest emission intensity for GDP too. Yet, it also has the largest capacity of solar and wind power. It also houses some of the largest manufacturers of wind, solar, lithium-ion batteries, and EVs. Thus, any discussion of the world's effort to limit warming below 1.5 degrees would be incomplete without a discussion on China's policy. It is why I'm really excited to introduce to you today Dr. Fan Dai. Fan is the director of the California-China Climate Institute. She previously served as special advisor on China to Governor Brown, where she chaired the state's China Interagency Working Group. We must really thank her for taking time off from watching the presidential inauguration to speak to us today. She has an intimate knowledge of both China's and US's climate policy. If we do have time, she might even end off with some insights on the US side too. As always, feel free to drop any questions you have in the comments. With that, I will hand over the time to Fan.
Great. Thank you, Sylvester, and it's really a pleasure talking to you. When I agreed to do that, I didn't realize it's actually the inauguration day today. So it's a very great day here in the US. Greetings from California, the East Coast. For those of you in the UK, good evening. I'm Fan Dai, as introduced. I'm the director of California-China Climate Institute. This is a newly established institute at the University of California, Berkeley. We are physically located in Berkeley Law School, and the institute is chaired by former Governor of California, Jerry Brown. Our mission at the institute is to advance the cooperation between California and hopefully now more US states with China on climate, energy, and environment-related issues. And it is really my pleasure today to share with you my insights on China's climate policy. I prepared some slides, which I'm ready to share with you. And please feel free to interrupt and jump in with questions while I'm going through those slides. So here we go. Let me know if you can see the slides on the
slides
screen.
are up.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No worries.
Wonderful. Alrighty. So the topic for today is China's climate policy. And I'd like to share with you my thoughts and opinion with those mainly from the three aspects here. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about the 2060 carbon neutrality pledge made by Chinese President Xi Jinping a couple months ago. And then I would like to share a few insights on China's upcoming 14th five-year plan. And lastly, I'd like to also talk about the carbon neutrality pathway overall, both from a Chinese policy perspective as well as where I am, California policy perspective. I hope those elements could be of interest to you and could be helpful when you think about China's climate policy overall. Again, feel free to bring up your questions during my presentation, or we would probably have some time after the presentation to dive into some of the questions you might have. Actually, before we dive into China's 2060 carbon neutrality pledge, let's take a look at what climate pledges China has already made on the international stage. I'd like to draw your attention on the first one, as I put in this table. This was after the Copenhagen COP in 2009. China, in its 13th five-year plan, which was from 2015 to 2020, set a target of carbon intensity, which is to reduce the carbon intensity about 43 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2020. And according to an assessment I saw last year, that China has already achieved this target. And of course, that target comes with non-fossil fuel energy percentage, which is about 15% in 2020. Again, I think that's already being met according to the 13th five-year plan assessment that I saw. And then there are also some targets on forest coverage and stock. So the first target set in for the timeline of Copenhagen under the Copenhagen Accord, which is also an economy-wide and ratified target. And then under the Paris Agreement, what China put in its national nations determined contribution, which is also called NDC, is China would be peaking its emission by 2030, and the non-fossil fuel energy share would increase to about 20% by 2030, and carbon intensity decrease about 60 to 65% below 2005 level by 2030. This is also a ratified and economy-wide target, and a large extent of those targets will be able to see how they would be realized during the 14th five-year plan, which is starting from this year to 2025. And then there comes President Xi's pledge made a couple months ago, and he announced that China would be carbon neutral, would try to be carbon neutral by 2060. So far, there hasn't been any information, as far as I know, that target's being ratified by any internal or domestic policies in China. And just from the carbon neutral target itself, my inclination is it's an economy-wide target as well. So now let's take a look at the 2060 carbon neutrality pledge. This pledge, as I mentioned, it was made by President Xi, and it was on September 22nd at the UN General Assembly. He announced that China would achieve carbon neutrality before 2060, and that China would strive to peak carbon emissions before 2030. So a couple quick points on this carbon neutrality pledge. First, I would say the pledge is definitely a watershed moment for global efforts to address climate change. It is the first time that China, as the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter, has committed to a long-term greenhouse gas emission reduction target. And notably, the announcement came directly from China's president. As the world's largest consumer of coal, China produces about 28% of the world's carbon emission and 26% of the world's greenhouse gases. And China's carbon neutrality pledge definitely demonstrates its intention to take ambitious and long-term action to address climate change. But while also not as noteworthy as the 2060 target, he also mentioned China to peak emissions before 2030, which is slightly different from what China put in its NDC by peak emissions by 2030. So it's a little bit different, a more stringent language putting in the announcement a couple months ago. So in this context, China peaks to emission before 2030 also represents an improvement on its Paris Agreement target, which and some researchers have already suggested that China is on track to peak its emission within the next decade. So I think it's reasonable and well enough to say that China is on track to achieve this 2030 target, and we'll see what policies they put in place to further achieve its 2060 carbon neutrality target. Here is a chart from Carbon Brief. So by some calculations, as you can see on this chart too, if China achieves carbon neutrality before 2060, it would actually require China to be on a much more steeper decline of its carbon emission compared to the baseline scenario. So if China achieved the carbon neutrality before 2060, that means it could avoid around at least 0.2 or 0.3 degrees of warming of this century that could be avoided. And also, meeting the 2060 pledge would avoid the release of about, this is according to an analysis, I'm quoting, to avoid the release about 215 gigatons of equivalent carbon dioxide over the next 4 decades. So it's actually a huge benefit to the global society. However, in the announcement, while it is historical, but it offered very few details about how China is going to achieve it. And I'm sure a lot of you are very interested in that question too. President Xi did not elaborate on how China would achieve the target or how carbon neutrality would be interpreted across sectors and regions in China. And that's a lot of us who are researching China's climate policy are hoping some of those questions could be answered in China's upcoming 14th five-year plan. And I would also just note that a major concern in China's recent surge in new coal capacity over especially the past 2 years. China's coal consumption rose dramatically in 2020 as the economy contracted for the first time in 30 years, even during COVID-19 disruptions. China currently has about 250 gigawatts of coal generation capacity under development. And this actually includes 48 gigawatts of new projects that's being approved recently. So by May of this year, carbon emissions from the energy production, cement making, by May of 2020, carbon emission from energy production, cement, and other industrial sources also had increased about 4%, higher than 2019. These are evidence that are that have been pointed to by a lot of scholars that criticizing or had questions about, on the one hand, China is making such ambitious target. On the other hand, the coal power plants, or the number of the coal power plants are increasing, and the emission from industrial sectors are also increasing. How do we get to understand this properly? So I guess one perspective I could offer and I could suggest is try to maybe look at its upcoming 14th five-year plan, see how things would be changed. So switching to the 14th five-year plan, let's first take a look at the 13th five-year plan, which I summarized the five-year plan in two sides. One is the achievement side, the other is the challenging side. On the achievements, as I mentioned, it already set a share of non-fossil fuel energy, and it's already achieved by actually a year before 2020. So that was achieved by 2019. And it also placed a cap on total energy consumption, which is likely to be included in the 14th five-year plan again, and it could be a really helpful policy element. And then the third is carbon intensity target. Again, it's already being achieved. Let's take a look at the challenges. So I summarized those three challenges. Actually, those were from Minister Xie, who was the former climate envoy in China. In one of his speech recently, he said, even though China has achieved most of its targets in the 13th five-year plan, there are still big challenges ahead. These are high energy intensity, especially in the manufacturing sector. Coal consumption still consists more than 50% of the total energy consumption, and its per GDP energy consumption is still very high compared to other developing countries as well as developed countries. So 14th five-year plan. So for the timeline of it, it's 2021 to 2025, which will be really a critical time for China's transition from what's called high-speed development with the two digits GDP growth to high-quality development. And China has set to achieve some of those targets that I put here in the next five-year plan period, including realizing the beautiful China goal, deliver on Paris Agreement commitment to peak emission by 2030, and also make progress on green transition and post-COVID-19 recovery. So the 14th five-year plan period, and the plan is actually going to be released this year, is a critical period of time in charting a more kind of detailed course for China in this green transition. Those key unanswered questions so far in the 14th five-year plan, could include the energy intensity target after 2020. What's going to be the energy intensity target? Whether or not there will be a carbon cap, which I already mentioned. Will they put a cap in the 14th five-year period? And how much share of non-fossil fuel energy will be in power generation, and whether fossil fuel subsidies will be eliminated? These are some important questions to be answered in the 14th five-year plan. And as I summarized here, the 14th five-year plan would likely to address implementation of carbon neutrality commitment, and whether or not to use carbon intensity as a binding target, approaches for reducing non-carbon emissions from industrial sources, metrics and co-benefits of controlling air pollution and reducing carbon emissions. This is extremely important, especially for the northern and western part of China, while air quality and air pollution still as the biggest environmental concern in those regions. And of course, China kicked off finally its national emission trading scheme, now hoping to have more sectors covered in addition to power sector. And there's also the climate-related lawmaking and enforcement, especially at local levels, and China's role within Paris Agreement, even outside of Paris Agreement, bilaterally and multilaterally with other countries. I think now with President Biden in the office in the US, starting from today, he will be signing a few executive orders to, one of those will be rejoining Paris Agreement. So it will be really interesting to see how China plays its role both within the Paris Agreement region as well as beyond Paris, and working with the US, the EU bilaterally on the climate issue. And then finally, on climate policy, I think it's really important we take an outlook of what the carbon neutrality pathway is going to look like. So I like to talk about the carbon neutrality pathways in two ways. One is to look at what projections has already been made from the Chinese scholars. And the other side is I'll try to share a snapshot of what a climate or carbon neutrality pathway looks like in California, which is the first U.S. state put in its executive order and legislation. There needs to be a carbon neutrality pathway. So in China, I think this is the study that has been quoted a lot of times recently, and it's a study by Tsinghua University. They did a report, and these are the top climate experts in China, both in Tsinghua University and other institutions across China. And the study has been highly recognized by the Ministry of Ecology and Environment in China. And they've been working quite closely with the ministry to help provide recommendations for China's actual carbon neutrality pathway making. So there's much uncertainty to start with around China's plan to achieve the goal. And research has shown that deep decarbonization and divestment from fossil fuels would provide a pathway toward carbon neutrality. Two big points is China's, according to the study at Tsinghua University, China's carbon emission could peak around 2025, and before beginning to decline around 2030. And also under a 1.5 degree scenario, by 2050, all carbon emissions from China's power sector will need to be net zero, and greenhouse gas emission will need to be reduced around 90% from peak levels to enable China on its track to carbon neutrality by 2060. Here you can see, I don't know if you can see those numbers clearly, but this plan from Tsinghua University's Institute of Energy, Environment and Economy, they entails a more kind of gradual transition over the next decade and a half, with a rapid acceleration after 2030 and 2035, that time period. So according to this research, China's pledge will require carbon emission to fall rapidly, with carbon emissions peaking, again, I mentioned around 2025, and then a steep decline after 2030, and total energy demand peaking around 2035, and coal-fired electricity being eliminated by 2050. This is a really interesting point. And additionally, it will require a significant shift from fossil fuels to renewables, which we'll talk about in the next slide. In addition to this report, there are also other reports and studies being done recently pointing out that in order for China to achieve carbon neutrality in its power sector, China will need to electrify its economy as much as possible, doubling generation by mid-century. And China would also need to decarbonize its other heavy fossil fuel reliant sectors, including transportation, buildings, and industry. So on this slide, you'll see this is a kind of a zooming of the energy sector. You'll see under the current plan, and this is a projection did by Tsinghua University, the coal-fired electricity would be eliminated by 2060, and China's energy mix would undergo a dramatic transformation. So power generation would nearly double from 2025 to about 16 terawatt hours in 2060. So electricity making up around 80% of total energy consumption in China by 2060. Wind, solar, nuclear power will be kind of really, as you see the size here, it's not double, it's tripled, and 5 times more for solar to increase the share in energy consumption. So if these targets could be realized, China's nuclear power generation is set to, so nuclear here is set to be about almost 4 times by 2060. And for the, again, for the wind and solar industry, it would also be a huge boost for them. The elimination of coal power, I think, will also call into question of dozens coal power plants already currently under construction in China, and that might continue to be a major issue, and would definitely be a big obstacle in the next few decades. So we'll see how China will be able to address this issue properly. And then just a quick look at California's pathway to carbon neutrality. For those who are unfamiliar with California's policy, California is the first US state put in both its executive order and legislation that California will be carbon neutral by 2045, which is 15 years ahead of China's schedule. So this pathway that you're seeing, it illustrates California's balanced approach for carbon neutrality. So we're taking 2 steps here, as you can see, outlining in this graph. First step is to strive for zero emission from all sources, including fossil fuel energy, including industrial processes, and natural and working lands. And the other step, step 2, is to maximize carbon sequestration. That includes carbon capture and sequestration, direct air capture, and natural working lands. What's also worth mentioning is that Governor Newsom, the current governor of California, had made 2 executive orders in 2020. One is to support zero emission from transportation sector by 2045, and reduction from natural and working sector land sector and enhanced carbon sequestration. So these are what's happening in California. I just wanted to also provide a quick outlook on the California's current approach. And I think that's also a biggest reason that why we're working with China on this topic, because a lot of California's current policies and approach for carbon neutrality might be of great help and be good resources to what policies China is going to make in the next few decades. And in the future, just wanted to highlight these are what we consider as pillar policies in California and more broadly the U.S. pathway to decarbonization: zero emission transportation, building, and zero waste industry, as well as reducing emission in the natural and working lands, which includes forestry, agriculture, wetlands, and other land types. It's also what we call nature-based climate solutions. I'll stop right here, and I hope these are some useful information for you, and feel free to ask any questions you might have, and I look forward to discussing with you in some of those issues in more details. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Van, for that very insightful talk. So I do have a few questions of my own, but maybe I'll just take some from the audience first. So
Okay.
I was actually asking whether China has reached its goal for the Copenhagen Accords. So I think that was in one of your earlier slides.
Yes, I can go back to one of these slides. Let me see. So yes, the answer is, and this is according to an assessment, I'm happy to provide this link to you, that what China pledged under Copenhagen Accord, including carbon intensity, non-fossil fuel energy share, and also forest cover and stock, that has been achieved during the 13th five-year plan period, which is 2016 to 2020. So that most of that has been achieved already.
Okay. And the next question from Rajashi. So is the 2030 peak, I guess he's talking about the 2030 goal to peak emission. Is it justifiable knowing that China is still building new coal plants? So I guess you talked about this already, but is there anything else you want to add on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think this is also gets a little bit complicated, because when you look at the peaking, the peaking target, which basically says China will peak before, now the language says before 2030. But what's going to happen is China is not going to, like the whole country is not going to, let's say, peak at a specific year. What's going to happen is you'll see some cities and provinces in China, and I would say mostly in coastal cities and those provinces and places, regions with better capacity and higher GDP growth, that will be able to be on a faster track to peak their emission, because they can do that. They have more resources and capability to do that. But if you look at those places that happen to also be more heavily relied on coal, especially the western part and middle part of China, that coal takes up a majority of their energy consumption. Those places, they're going to be on a different track, or at least different pace to get to carbon emission peaking. So I think it's justifiable that China is still building new coal power plants just to kind of meet the energy needs. But it's also questionable that how China is going to really diversify and its strategy in different regions across different cities and provinces to deal with this issue. And in general, I would just say, if we could, there is a way China could, again, I think reference in the Tsinghua study is they need to eliminate coal anyways by 2050. So if that's the overarching scenario, then China might need to think about where would be the places that they could, phase out coal more rapidly versus places that they will be facing a lot of resistance and struggling with economic growth and environmental justice and all that issues. So again, this is a really good question, but I don't think there is like a unified answer for if you look at different regions in China.
Yeah, and just a question from myself. So on this same issue of kind of coal consumption, so a significant portion of China's coal consumption is also in harder to decarbonize use for concrete, for steel. So there's sufficient public investments into research as well as subsidies for kind of cleaner alternatives, whether be it electrification, carbon capture.
Yeah, that's another good question. I might answer by using an example as we recently studied with the question in mind that why it's so hard to decarbonize the energy sector in China and industry sectors too, is when we look at, if you look at how China's grid is set up for, it's actually set up for a high percentage of coal, or we can say fossil fuel energy. So it's not just, if you look at the cost of solar and wind, it's actually being really dramatically lower than a couple of decades ago. So it's not because the cost of solar, it's actually taking much more time for the grid to be equipped or set up for a high percentage of renewable energy, because there is what we call dark curve, is without energy storage, the grid reliability or stability is an issue for if you have too high percentage of renewable energy plugged into the grid. There might be blackouts, there might be all this type of stability issues that hasn't been really resolved yet, especially in some of those regions. So I think, to your question, I think if you want to look at this decarbonization issue sector by sector, you might find different obstacles in different sectors. For example, power sector, as I mentioned, I think the biggest obstacles are two. One is the pricing signal. The pricing hasn't really reflect the actual cost of solar plus storage. The other obstacle, as I mentioned, would be to how the grid system could be equipped and improved to integrate more renewable sources. But if you look at the industry sectors, I think it also varies by those heavy industries and lighter industries. They have different consideration behind their choices in terms of where their power or their energy would be from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just another question from the audience. So Anlin was asking, which area or sector do you think has the biggest potential for China to reduce its emission and meet its carbon neutrality goal? So which sector do you think?
I think it will still be the power sector, which is the energy consumption, and I think CCUS, is the carbon capture and storage, has been a big topic in China in terms of how they could both reduce coal usage but also use coal more clean. So that's been a really debatable issue too, because on one hand, we want China to stop using coal, so we shouldn't discuss clean coal. There should be no coal. But on the other hand, it's not realistic that to ask China to transition or phase out coal overnight. So it has to be on a transition to no coal, and the transition will include some solutions like CCUS and biomass. But those solutions largely that I have seen are actually dealing with the power sector transition. So I think the power sector will still be the sector that with the biggest potential for decarbonization.
Okay. Yeah, and just a question from myself. So you were talking about CCUS. So it seems like China's decarbonization effort is still largely focused on kind of the economic advantage of decarbonization. So do you foresee in the future China actually committing to costly but necessary negative emissions? So it's like how the IPCC has said that if we remain below 1.5 degrees, we actually need negative emission technology. And there's actually limited, in a sense, economic advantage, at least direct economic advantage of those negative emissions. Yeah, so do you actually see them committing to such investments?
Yeah, my answer is yes and no. Yes, personally and selfishly, I would love to see China commit for such negative emission targets. No, politically, I think it's really hard because it's hard enough for us to get to Paris Agreement target, and it's even not 1.5, right? So there's going to be really big political resistance, and there will be argument made by those traditional industries and highly relied on fossil fuel sectors, that how are they going to make money if even China hasn't really achieved the carbon neutrality target, even the peaking target yet, and you're talking about negative emissions. It's a little bit kind of out of their reach, I would say. And I think what my understanding of China's political system is, it mostly, when it makes any announcement, it won't like like the US, we can just we during Trump withdraw from Paris Agreement. That's not going to happen in China. So once there's a political statement or announcement made, they will always want to achieve that target. So that makes it really hard for, at the political level, for China to commit to such a goal that it's really far away. So I think realistically and politically, it's going to be really hard.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess you were talking about how China's 2060 carbon neutrality does not even meet the 1.5 degrees target, right? So we actually have this question from Pietro. So he said the Californian roadmap is not a roadmap for staying below 1.5 degrees temperature increase. So he's asking how many degrees Celsius does the Chinese plan actually envisage? So I guess how much are they actually saying? What are they aiming for?
So yeah, this is a great question, and I think we can spend days discussing the different scenarios from different modeling approach. I think in the presentation that I did today, when I quoted the study from Tsinghua University, they actually had done, I believe, 4 scenarios. The 1.5 scenario is one of them, which I think is the most appropriate in terms of the level of ambition, but also in terms of the possibility of achieving that target. So I think among those scenarios, even if you're looking at California's roadmap, we had before that roadmap is being kind of put out there, we actually done intensive modeling of under different scenarios too. So it's not simply a 1.5 or 2 degree scenario. We had to address many factors in it. I think the most commonly recognized scenario now, it's 1.5 degrees. And I think I'm saying this because I think it's both pointed out by the IPCC report, as well as those jurisdictions that we've seen have provided a carbon neutrality roadmap or pathway. I think 1.5 degree is the kind of the ambition level of scenario that they're looking at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just another question from myself. So previously you very quickly talked about the emissions trading scheme and how that is being implemented for the power sector. So it seems like the price that China is putting for its emission trading scheme is still relatively low. So how effective do you actually see it being, as opposed to just kind of like regulations and direct investment? Yeah, how effective do you think this trading scheme would actually be in the coming few years?
I think it's so my honest evaluation is I don't think it's as robust as expected, the trading scheme, but it's understandable because the size of the market is actually huge. So and it's not uncommon to see the price at this level, because at the kind of the first stage, which is the piloting emission trading schemes in China, they had like several piloting markets across the country. I remember seeing one provincial pilot with a larger trading volume. Their price was actually more reasonable, not as low as those other places. Mm-hmm. And so my understanding and my sense of, the reasons to lead to lower prices normally is when you have a cap is too loose, that you basically are allocating too many allowances to the covered entities, and they don't actually, there's not a huge need to purchase. So the price is actually, there's the price is normally pretty low. And the other major reason could be the benchmarking approach that you're using. At least I know at the beginning of carbon ETS scheme in China, some of those pilots, they used the grandfathering approach to do their benchmarking. So that also leads to a lower requirement of performance. So there is also another kind of reason to lead to lower prices. From the California's experiences, what I found really helpful for at least incentivize more participation in the market is we have a declining cap. So the cap is actually declining each year, and that would actually help to both kind of enhancing the level of anticipation for performance from those covered industries. And the other side is we had actually designed what's called flooring price and ceiling price. And that would actually set a really good signal to those industries and covered entities about what kind of margin and profits they're expecting when the price goes up, when the price goes down, and they'll that would actually incentivize the trading of trading activities. And then also the third element I would recommend is the benchmarking approach. Grandfathering is not the best one. I think a lot of those we're now using different methodology to set the benchmark right for different industry. And for cement and for steel and other industry, these are I think you need to have a more stringent or higher expectation of performance for them. So choosing the right benchmarking approach would also help incentivize market activities.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot for the answer. So I guess that's all the questions I have as well as the audience. So yeah, quite a few of them has also thank you and the comments for this talk. So yeah, just once again, like to thank you for having this talk with us, as well as missing the inauguration for this. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, and just quickly to the audience, we'll see you next week.